So this is the 1988 novelization of the Lucasfilm fantasy epic Willow, written by Wayland, based on the screenplay by Bob Dolman, which is in turn based on the story by George Lucas. I'm assuming anyone watching this is familiar with the premise of Willow. Just to briefly recap, this unnamed medieval fantasy realm of humans, aka Daikinis, fairy folk, and the hobbit-esque Nelwyns has been conquered by the evil sorceress Queen Bavmorda, hailing from Nockmaar. The kingdom of Tir Asleen has been long encased in ice, the kingdom of Galadorn recently destroyed along with its armies. The only remaining free corner of the land may be Nelwyn Valley, where dwell the aforementioned Nelwyns. All hope seems lost until Bavmorda's druids foresee her destruction by a child born with a special mark on her arm. A child destined to be Empress. This newborn baby is Elora Danon, barely saved from being sacrificed and instead sent down a river, where she ends up ashore at the farm of aspiring Nelwyn sorcerer Willow Ufgood. Willow is tasked with getting this MacGuffin baby Elora to Tir Asleen, narrowly evading evil, being joined by warriors, brownies, and a sorceress along his way. Now, as far as novelizations go, this is definitely on the closely hewing side of things. Basically, the only film scenes I noticed missing were side scenes with Bavmorda. In this version, we still see her at the beginning, first in a new scene initially feeding prisoners to death dogs before proceeding into Nockmaar's bowels, where we saw her first screen appearance. But after that, we never see her on screen again in the book until General Kale delivers the captured Elora Danon to Bavmorda at the end, and she starts setting up the ritual of oblivion. But other than that, this is the exact same narrative as the film. There's tiny differences, like
we have a lot of gophers.
In the film becomes, we have a lot of hedgehogs, that level of tiny. Right down to, as best I could tell, nearly every single chant and incantation being faithfully recreated from how Warwick Davis, Patricia Hayes, and Jean Marsh said them in the film.
Willow.
Believe in the word. That's the word that pleads for change.
But while Wayland Drew's book subtracts almost nothing, it does add things. Not that much, as this original 1988 printing of the book I have still comes out to a pretty slim 278 pages, but little scenes here and there and character backstories. There's probably dozens of tiny nuggets of extra info I could go through one by one. For example, we learn that the nursemaid who rescues and sacrifices herself for Elora is named Ethna, and that Willow's strict and magic disapproving father was named Schnorr Ufgood, making Sheev Palpatine thrilled to no longer be George Lucas's worst first name of all time. But I'll just go briefly through first new scenes and then new backstory. We get a whole bit when Elora is going down the river at the beginning, where the various critters of the forest, that is birds, fish, an otter, even a bear, come out to nudge her life raft along when it gets caught. At Mad Mardigan's cage, we get an encounter with some strange tattooed tribesmen called Pohas, whom Mad Mardigan is told to have come up fighting during his early years of soldiery. And we get the famous deleted fish boy encounter before Willow reaches Finrazel's island, which explains why Willow only uses 2 of his 3 magic acorns in the film's final cut. After Willow, Mad Mardigan, and company head out of this little snow town that they discover and hide in, narrowly escaping the Nockmaarians. In the film version, we briefly see the townsfolk rising up in rebellion, but they go a little more in depth on that on the page here. We see the villagers and Eric's forces actually forming a line and riding down the Nockmaarians. The most wholly new sequence is after that, when escaping from Kale's forces. Willow and the rest go through this labyrinth of ice caves before they get to Tir Asleen. They find this frozen-in-time aftermath of this great battle between elves and mountain trolls, their corpses and weapons and the bloody remnants of an ancient war long preserved. I'm fascinated to know if this was actually in the original screenplay at some point, or if it's just something Wayland Drew came up with and stuck in there. And finally, as you may see in the deleted scenes on the Willow DVD, Sorsha finding her magically frozen father in Tir Asleen, although in this book version he's actually been truly frozen in time at the moment of Bavmorda's curse, and still appears to be in his early to mid-30s. Actually, I wish they'd kept this scene in the film, as it makes Sorsha's heel face turn play a little more believably.
And you have seen your father. Yes, I have.
Even more interesting for a Willow movie fan such as myself is new backstory. One surprising character who gets a ton relative to the size of the book is Vonkar, the best warrior in Nelwyn Valley. In the film, this character has just a couple lines and a few minutes of screen time.
Was looking for somebody's baby.
But this novel goes in depth for several pages on his journeys and how after seeing Nockmaar in person he dedicated himself to the defense of the Nelwyns. One paragraph would have been fine, but Wayland went all in. More relevant to the film is a good bit more Mad Mardigan backstory, some of it surprising. The fact that he's a son of nobility who became more taken by the sword than statescraft, not too shocking, nor is his enmity with Eric stemming from his own desertion. But there's also interesting stuff about his initial days of soldiery, and the fact that he's actually already somewhat acquainted with the brownies and with Sholindria, something I certainly never got from the film. In fact, he's so acquainted that Franjean the brownie is the one who tells Willow all of this. Best of all is a lot of Finrazel and Bavmorda backstory from the old days of Tir Asleen, where they were both young magical prodigies and had a downright Katie Heron, Regina George-esque teen girl rivalry for the heart of the same boy, the Prince of Tir Asleen. After bewitching, bedding, and wedding him, Bavmorda then likely hastened the king and queen to early deaths so she could rise with her husband to the throne of Tir Asleen, upon which she supplanted and froze the king, changed Finrazel to a possum, became a brutal tyrant, founded Nockmaar, etc., etc. This also explains why Tir Asleen and Nockmaar appear so close to each other. That wasn't just the film making things seem that was the case. Nope, they're actually like a few miles apart, within same-day walking distance. I'd say the book has a somewhat darker tone than the movie. We get even more of an impression of how much things suck under Bavmorda's rule. The entire country outside of Nelwyn Valley has a very almost Nazi Germany-esque despairing tone of villages constantly being beset and enslaved, wagons full of pregnant women being carted away to be imprisoned or murdered. You definitely get a sense here that, yeah, this Bavmorda problem really does need immediately taken care of. I think that a lot of Wayland prose is lovely and enchanting when it comes to locations and settings. Just for example, when they're riding up to Tir Asleen, the castle rose ahead, the most magnificent structure Willow had ever seen. Built of the same marble as the road, it glowed so pure and white under the full sun that it seemed a source of light itself. 2 corbelled towers rose like welcoming arms beside the lowered drawbridge. Sunlight glinted on the banners on their flagstaffs, and on the crenels and merlons of the battlements. Sunlight flashed on the silver surface of the moat. It seemed to Willow as they approached that a party of knights must come riding out to welcome them. I just love that kind of thing in fantasy novels. I don't know quite how to articulate this, but somehow my all-time favorite era for prose in literary fantasy is like the late 80s through the mid-90s. Removed from some of the older stodginess and newer pretensions, the descriptions in that era just hit different. The possibly more critical counterexample to that might be the action scenes. It's not that they're bad per se, just almost all vanishingly brief. Not every written fantasy action scene has to lovingly describe each and every strike and parry and dodge of every sword fight, no. But this goes hard the opposite direction, giving us this very bird's eye, broad strokes approach of nearly every action sequence, save perhaps the inescape by Wagon. Just to give examples, the epic encounter in Tir Asleen with the 2-headed dragon Iborsisk. In this book, the dragon is born and rises from the water right here. Flip the page, and here, 2 pages later, the dragon is killed. It really reads like the author didn't even want to do the damn dragon, but had to, so just kinda half-assed it. Similarly, the entire final battle sequence, from Willow first banging the drum to
It was just my old disappearing pig trick.
is contained in just 12 pages. I've read tons of other fantasy books that'll dedicate 12 pages to characters having a single meal, or walking through a forest, or looking for an inn to stay in. Mad Mardigan and Kale's entire climactic duel is confined to a single paragraph. Heck, 12 pages? That's only about twice and change the length of Vonkar's backstory. I don't really know anything about Wayland outside of this book, but my read would be that he was less of the new school of action fantasy writer and more of the Tolkien school of approaching fantasy from the tradition of medievalism, nature, chivalry, and whatnot, because I get the impression that describing crossed swords checking descending blades at the last second and whatnot of little interest to him as a writer. Since we're talking Willow books, I should at least briefly mention Chris Claremont and George Lucas's Willow sequel trilogy, Chronicles of the Shadow War. This book comes really close to not violating their canon at all. Just one little bit in the last chapter presents an issue, when it tells that Nockmaar would again grow green absent Bavmorda's influence, the abandoned castle in time crumbling to ruin. Now this directly contradicts the 3rd Shadow War book, Shadow Star, which explicitly tells that Nockmaar stayed as demonic as ever after Bavmorda's end, the land itself cursed, and that not only did Nockmaar Castle not crumble, but the men who actively tried to demolish it failed to do so, the castle itself indestructible, pulsing with dark life and rejecting every attempt to put so much as a scratch on it, still looking exactly as it did in Willow over a decade later, which plays into the plot of Shadowstar. So, tiny issue there. I think George Lucas should probably do a special edition of the novel where he deletes that one line and maybe add some CGI dinosaurs to the tavern scene. But yeah, that pretty much sums up Wayland Drew's Willow. I got my copy on Thrift Books for like $4, so check it out if you're interested. And remember,
You never ever give a baby black root.